Greetings, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Chaucer's Books virtual author discussion with journalist Scott Meslow, the author of From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall, and Rise Again of the romantic comedy. I'm Michael Takeuchi. I'm the events coordinator at Chaucer's Bookstore, a 47-year-old independent bookstore located in Santa Barbara, California. To purchase tonight's book, browse other titles, or check out our upcoming events, please go to our website at chaucersbooks.com. Speaking of upcoming events, we have two online in the coming week, starting Sunday, February 13th, where our theme of love continues with Dr. Anna Mashin. She'll talk about her book, Why We Love, the new science behind our closest relationships. Then on the 15th at 7, that's at noon on Sunday. Then on the 15th at 7 p.m., we'll have local author Olivia Seltzer cram this book. While our guests and I are the only ones seen and heard on this webinar, please feel free to utilize the Q&A function located at the bottom of your screen. We'll get to these questions, type them in as we go. We'll get to these questions at the end. Tonight's event is being simulcasted and recorded for our YouTube channel and will be available to view after program's completion. For our YouTubers, please post your any questions you have in the chat, and we'll get to those as well. So let's begin our talk about From Hollywood with Love, the rise and fall and rise again of the romantic comedy by bringing out its author, Scott Meslow.
Hey, everybody.
Greetings, Scott. So somebody wrote the most convincing defense of the rom-com to date, but I thought it kind of shortchanged you because it's really an amazing book, and I just wanted to congratulate you on that because it really touches all the bases while giving the trends of what's going on in the movies today. So congratulations on your book. I was not a rom-com I said I didn't like rom-coms, but then I read your book and it's like, oh, Crazy Rich Asians. Oh, I like that movie. Or Carrie Met Sally. That's a great movie. Four Weddings and a Funeral. So I guess I'm a closeted rom-com lover. So thanks to you.
Welcome to the club.
Thank you. So Scott, you're a senior editor at The Week magazine and you're a writer and critic for publications including GQ, New York Magazine, and The Atlantic. This is your first book. To join us in conversation, to enliven this conversation, class it up, let's bring out Samantha Rollins.
Hi.
Hi, Samantha. So Samantha is the deputy entertainment editor at Bustle, where she oversees coverage of movies, television, music, and celebrity. She's previously worked for Vulture, The Week, and the New York Times, and she's written for publications including GQ and Paste. Thank you very much for joining us, Samantha. And before you guys begin your discussion, I wanted to know what you thought about the book and what struck you about this book.
I don't think I've ever read a book that so comprehensively talks about movies, both from the perspective of a fan and also from the industry perspective. And I think and there are a lot of great things about this book, but I love that it marries the two of them, those two perspectives so well. Often you read a book and it might just be all about the behind the scenes Hollywood secrets, or it might be, just totally praising why fans love a bunch of different things. I really love the dual perspectives that we had here. And also just the scope.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing that and take it away. I can't wait to hear this talk.
Yeah.
Thanks, Michael.
Well, I'm so excited to be here with you, Scott. Hi. Who better to talk on the Valentine's Eve about rom-coms than with the rom-com expert himself. So I think starting from the beginning, something that's much debated is what do we consider a rom-com? What do you consider a rom-com? And for the purposes of the book, what did you consider a rom-com? And are they the same thing?
Yeah, it's a good question because it's certainly one of the first ones I had to answer. It's like, oh, I want to write a book about rom-coms. And I go, well, how exactly am I defining what a rom-com is? And it's funny, as I reported out the book, there were so many times people say, "Oh, I love that. My favorite movie's The Devil Wears Prada or Miss Congeniality." I always had to stop and say, "Well, I'm not quite sure that's in the purview of the book." The working definition that I finally came up with was pretty simple. It's basically a test you can apply to any movie to see if it's a rom-com, patent pending. The first thing is it a movie that makes you laugh more than it makes you sad? That at least covers the comedy side. And the second thing is, if there's a romance in the movie, but you pull the romance out of the movie, is there still a movie or does the whole thing collapse? And what I found is that if the answer is there is no movie without that romance, it is probably a romantic comedy. That's where something like Miss Congeniality, which has a great romantic subplot, if that subplot is not there, it is still a movie about an FBI agent going uncover at a beauty pageant, and it's a pretty good comedy. It's better with the romantic subplot, but it's not a rom-com in the way that When Harry Met Sally doesn't exist if there's not a Harry and Sally relationship. There is no movie at all. Or at least a very short movie.
Putting that criteria together, was there anything you were like, I really want to include this one though?
There were so many that were sort of on the line that I kind of had to kind of think about whether or not they qualified. I've had people argue with me even about the movies that are covered in the book.
Which ones?
Knocked Up, some people are like, oh, that's more of like a dude comedy than a rom-com, but I think that's like a pretty classically structured romantic comedy. If you look, it's got a meet cute at a bar. They happen to get pregnant a little sooner than a traditional couple would do, but when you follow the basic beats of it, I think it's still there.
And what was one that you kind of wanted to include in fall? You couldn't.
Yeah, I mean, Devil Wears Prada is a good example of that, where it's a movie I like a lot, and people always think of it as a rom-com, and so that's one where I get the frustration that it's not in there. Or I had for a long time, the book was going to have more about teen rom-coms, and I really wanted to have Clueless in there, or 10 Things I Hate About You, or any of these movies, and I think they do qualify as rom-coms, but as I started to work on those chapters, I kind of realized this is taking me down a whole different avenue that would add, a whole new thing that I would have to cover in the scope of the book. And I think that would have, maybe that's a book that someone else should write, because I think there's plenty to say there.
Yeah, you have to cut yourself off somewhere. There's like a whole other conversation we could be having about TV series with rom-com elements. And I also think that that's another thing that it's like, you gotta cut it off at some point.
Yeah, exactly.
But you start the book with When Harry Met Sally. Obviously a great and iconic movie to start a book with, but what was it about that time in 1989 that you think sort of set the stage for this golden age of rom-coms? I
think that was a really fascinating time in rom-coms. I mean, the reason that I used that to kick off the start of the book was that I think the modern Hollywood template for a rom-com in the movies that I'm covering in the book were basically set by When Harry Met Sally. I think one of the things that's really interesting to me about When Harry Met Sally, which cards on the table, is my favorite rom-com. I know it's not the world's most exciting answer. When you tell people that's a great movie, they're not shocked to hear that you think that. It's pretty widely acknowledged. But when I really unpacked it, it's kind of an unacknowledged Annie Hall remake. It is taking so much of what Woody Allen was doing with that movie, except putting a little more of a Hollywood veneer on it, right to, the original ending that Rob Reiner had planned for that movie was actually a pretty serious and somber ending, not unlike Annie Hall, where Harry and Sally do not end up together and they encounter each other on the street later and have kind of a wistful goodbye. And then Rob Reiner met the love of his life while he was making the movie and was convinced that love was real again and decided to do what is one of the most sublime endings you could possibly have in a romantic comedy. I mean, as Hollywood and big as it is, to have, the running through the streets to get there on New Year's Eve and to deliver that speech and then to have them do the talking head at the end. I'm assuming people watching this are familiar with When Harry Met Sally. Sorry for the spoiler. But to have all of that happen, I think that decision to me is what every rom-com followed from then on out. There are rom-coms that subverted it, but you had to one way or another answer, we're going to make a serious movie about relationships, but we are going to embrace the almost fantasy of a romance like that. And I think that's what rom-coms picked up from there.
Yeah. Something that was interesting is about, I almost said Pretty Woman, but I mean My Best Friend's Wedding, wrong Julia Roberts movie. One of the first, I guess, to subvert that overtly. Why do you think that one worked? And also, I'm kind of struggling to find other movies that successfully subvert tropes in the same way. But first, why do you think that one actually succeeded when it could have failed so much?
That is a crazy story in general, and that's a movie that I covered in a lot of detail in the movie. I talked to the director PJ Hogan and the screenwriter Ron Bass about that pretty extensively, because Ron really sat down to start writing that movie, going, "I want to make a rom-com where the most beloved, likable character that everyone's going to like best is a gay man, and B, I want to make a rom-com where she does not end up with the guy." And basically, the reason that Ron was able to get away with that is he was such a hot commodity in Hollywood at the time. He was off a string of hits that he could sort of just get stuff going because he wanted to, and there was a lot of interest. But that to me is it is a movie that really only, I mean, there's so many things that needed to go right for that movie. I adore that movie. And for that movie to be as good as it is, a lot of things needed to go right. But I do think it really comes down to Julia Roberts wanting to do it and committing to doing it. To have a rom-com actress of that caliber who audiences are already so enamored with, who has a history in the genre, so that she can kind of fool you, that you go into that thinking you're watching a Julia Roberts rom-com, and you may well think, oh, this is a movie about how the guy she's in love with is going to marry this horrible woman and he doesn't realize it, and she has to break up the wedding because they're supposed to be together. And I think for a while, the movie actually does take you on that journey. And for most people, there is a point at which, and it might be different for everybody, but there's a point where you go, I don't think I'm on board with what she's doing. Cameron Diaz actually seems pretty nice, and Julianne is doing some horrible, horrible things. And I think to get to that movie did not have an easy production process. I mean, they had to reshoot basically the entire climax because the movie ultimately went a little too easy on Julianne and gave her a romance at the end that nobody really liked. So I think it took a lot of work and finesse just to get to that point. But I think the smart enough people who were working on that found the way to thread that needle. And I think the reason you haven't seen it again is it's hard. There are other movies that try to do kind of unconventional rom-com endings, but I find most of them are not that successful. And I think it's as simple as good luck.
Yeah, I was going to say, are there any, I think it's so difficult to be surprised sort of by Hollywood anymore. It's especially when, not even just in romantic comedies, but in general, when Hollywood latches onto a trope, you see it again and again and again. In romantic comedies, are there any either recent, not so recent, that have genuinely surprised you? I think what My Best Friend's Wedding did is one of the few like sort of genuinely surprising moments I can think of in terms of the genre.
There are others that have played around in that space. I think it's debatable whether The Breakup counts as a romantic comedy because it's a pretty serious comedy. That's a weird one because it was marketed so much broader than it turned out to be. But that is a movie that does what it says on the tin. That is a movie about a breakup. I think you can kind of watch that thinking like, but then they're going to realize they should be together. And it's a tougher movie than that. And again, I think it took those stars wanting to make that movie at that time for Hollywood to say, okay. But even then, they clearly didn't know how to market it. I think it's a bit of a confused movie. There are others in that vein. People would certainly point to 500 Days of Summer, which I think is a complicated movie. I think it's successful in what it's trying to do, but I know there's been a lot of backlash about whether or not it's a little too sympathetic to the Joseph Gordon-Levitt character. But that is, that's a movie where, again, it's kind of about a guy who loves romantic comedies a little too much. And so he imagines himself in one right down to his dance routine to Hall & Oates in the street. And what the movie thinks he's wrong and eventually makes him wrong. It still kind of lets him off the hook because then he meets Autumn at the end, adorable, everybody grown. But it is at least, you can find a thread of these movies that have at least not made it so easy for the central couple or convincingly argued that they shouldn't be together. There aren't a ton, but they do exist.
Obviously, we're already talking a lot about tropes, and every genre has a trope, but it feels like, to me, sometimes the rom-com wouldn't exist without its tropes.
Mm-hmm.
And do you agree? And like, is there such thing as a naturalistic rom-com? And what would that even look like? Or have you seen any?
Yeah, I think the tropes are part of what people love about rom-coms. I think audiences, I really do think audiences are sophisticated. I don't think they go in not realizing those tropes are going to be there. I think they enjoy watching them pulled off, and ideally pulled off with a lot of panache and cleverness, and sometimes they can find ways to fool you even while they indulge in them. I mean, there's a reason that rom-coms have ended in marriage since Shakespeare's time. Like these are durable tropes for a reason. Audiences respond to them. There's a very natural dramatic arc that is satisfying and enjoyable to watch. But I think when it comes to subversion, you need to to do something a little different with it, the way you're describing, is a challenge in itself, because that can become its own trap of, we're not doing what those other movies did, and that itself, like in some ways, I think embracing the tropes with sincerity instead of being sort of arch about it. A movie that I cover in the book that I actually quite like is Friends with Benefits, but that is a movie that is very explicitly about people who have watched rom-coms, don't really want to be in a rom-com. There's a fake rom-com in the movie that they're constantly watching and commenting on, and the joke in that, or one of many jokes in that, is that they start the movie kind of making fun of the end credits of this movie, where they're playing Hey Soul Sister. And then inevitably, Friends with Benefits ends with Hey Soul Sister playing over the credits. And I think that's a pretty clever kind of meta way to address the tropes. But I also think that's about as far as you can take it. Or if you want to go to the next step, something like Isn't It Romantic, where Rebel Wilson wakes up in a rom-com universe where all of the tropes are just played up to, all the way, like dialed up as high as they possibly could. And I think that's like a fun and satisfying and charming movie, but like, you can't go further than that. At some point, you need to stop talking about how you're aware you're in a romantic comedy and just make a romantic comedy.
Yeah, I definitely think, of course, in this newer age of rom-coms and just the fact that the genre has been so long running, there's more of an impulse to have to reference. You have to be self-aware or recognize the tropes, just because they've been around for so long, or that's an impulse, whether a good one or a bad one, by the writers to have to do that. Do you have a favorite trope though? Like, I don't know. I love that there just happen to be architects. Like, I understand why there's always a journalist or a writer in a rom-com, because writers love to put themselves in things. Like, it's annoying. I hate seeing it, but I get why it's there. I don't understand the architect thing, but I love it.
I think it's a non-specific creative job that we all know like just enough about. They're like, oh yeah, they're walking around with blueprints right now. That makes sense.
Yeah. I guess you could, like, if you're a screenwriter and you think you're very smart, it's like, oh, he's crafting our, building the foundation of
I'm not even sure they go that far. It's just like an office in New York. Great. Architect.
True.
That probably.
True. Very true. Another thing I love about this book is the essays in between the chapters about different actors and their careers in romantic comedies, especially in the beginning. So many heavy hitters like Hugh Grant and Julia Roberts. And something that I think about is just like both of those actors don't do romantic comedies anymore. What do you think separates some of the rom-com leads of the golden age, so to speak, from the rom-com leads we have now, or are they similar?
Yeah, I think what's mainly changed in terms of the type of people who star in romantic comedies, it's weird because I lament that there are fewer romantic comedies and fewer stars making romantic comedies, but I actually think it's broadly a good trend for Hollywood, because I think what's happened is actors just haven't gotten as pigeonholed. It was very much an era where, Julia Roberts or Meg Ryan, or even Hugh Grant, these actors kind of got stuck where it was what they were known for. But we're in an era now where, Emma Stone can make Easy A or Crazy Stupid Love and then make Birdman and be up for an Oscar, or La La Land, and then make Spider-Man and, be in a giant superhero blockbuster. And audiences just and studios seem much more comfortable just letting people drift between the different genres. So I think that what I want is for people to keep making rom-coms. I just don't think it needs to be all that they make.
Yeah, definitely. And there are, of course, lots of reasons that you outline in the book about the reasons that we've made fewer rom-coms, or the ways that Hollywood has sort of diversified their genre offerings. But as far as people, when you wrote essays about people, is there anyone whose career fascinated you that you were like, I could write 100 pages about this?
For sure. For those who haven't read the book yet, there are shorter essays in the book that don't cover movies specifically, but get into kind of the careers of actors. And that was really satisfying because it let me cover a lot of movies in one ground, but it also led me to be like, I want to go so deep on all of these people. I find Will Smith's career in rom-coms so interesting because he made one, and for very frustrating and complicated reasons, didn't want to make more. And I think he is maybe the most charismatic actor on the planet at his best. And I think he is so well suited for rom-coms because he is so charming and likable. And one thing that happened on that movie is they did not want to cast a white actress as the female lead because in America in particular, they were worried that audiences wouldn't be comfortable with that. And this was 2004. Like this is very recent history. And so that to me was such a fascinating, like what could have been if things weren't so messed up in this industry that is so risk averse that it like tips into racism because they think that's going to affect the business. That to me was something that was I just kind of sat and thought about it and got frustrated by it. And that comes up J-Lo had a very similar arc, and she's amazing because she is such a big star. She can do literally anything she wants. And she just loves rom-coms and wants to make them and has 2 coming out this year. And like, she very much doesn't have to keep making rom-coms if she doesn't want to. But for me, it's the people who really have a genuine affection for the genre that I find most interesting.
Yeah, the Will Smith chapter really fascinated me as well, because you just think about if this had been, nowadays and he was younger, I don't know that he maybe would have had some obstacles, but probably not in the same way. Also, did you write in there that he said he turned down the role of Batman too?
Superman, yes.
Man?
Yeah. And what he said, Will Smith is very candid in interviews. He said that, audiences don't want people messing with their white superheroes, basically. Like he was worried about a backlash, and I think he was right. I hate that that's the Hollywood culture that we're living in, but every even minor deviation from kind of what people expect from this stuff leads to a huge internet backlash now. I do think that there would have been a vocal subset of fans who had a real problem.
Yeah. Speaking of, I guess, diversity, so to speak, on screen, something as somebody who saw My Big Fat Greek Wedding in theaters and just experienced it as the phenomenon it was, I was really surprised to learn about how long of a journey that one took to come to screen, and how it was actually basically an indie movie that Nia Vardalos wrote, that it was her own one-woman show. And it's just very interesting to compare that and also the journey that Crazy Rich Asians has had coming to screen. I think they both sort of have had their own difficulties as, showing and celebrating the culture of an underrepresented group. But did you think at all, I feel like there is some sort of comparison there between the difficulties that they both face, but like how the industry has changed in the meantime. Did you think about that?
I think both of those stories are so interesting because what happened with My Big Fat Greek Wedding was that Nia Vardalos just had a really strong idea for something she wanted to do, and quite literally put it on as a one-woman show. It picked up steam in LA largely through word of mouth, starting with her going to Greek Orthodox churches, but it soon reached beyond the Greek audience. One of the things that she talked about with me that I found so interesting is the cultural specificity of that movie actually seemed to expand its audience, because what she found is that people would come up to her and they wouldn't be Greek, but they would say, oh, my dad doesn't do the Windex thing, but he does this thing. And it was like the broader patterns of like the way that people are, like people really appreciated that and they saw themselves in that. It didn't need to be a literal 1-1 thing. But even then, that was a movie that had the backing of Rita Wilson and Tom Hanks, that was shot in the can, and they still, even with those connections, had a really hard time getting it distributed. And it's just, there was so little faith in Hollywood for a movie that looked like that, and it went on to be the highest grossing rom-com and independent movie of all time. Like at the time, it was this massive hit that really came from one person with a very specific vision based very much on her own life. Crazy Rich Asians is interesting because that obviously, it was the first majority cast of Chinese descent in Joy Luck Club. Like it was a huge benchmark, but at the same time, there was a sense that it could be a huge phenomenon, I think largely because the novels had been so successful, that there was a crazy bidding war for that movie, where it was literally, they in 15 minutes, because Warner Brothers was operating like the mafia, they had to make the decision if they were going to go to Warner Brothers for a traditional kind of theatrical release, in all the theaters across the world, the whole deal, or Netflix offering them some insane amount of money and a guarantee that the whole trilogy would be greenlit up front, which is kind of the Netflix model. You can see that with The Kissing Booth or To All the Boys I've Loved Before. When they have something, they really want to do it. And in the end, the creative team behind that decided it was just symbolically more important for that movie to get a theatrical release. But as it well turned out, there was hunger for it. And I do think that's where you saw something similar with My Big Fat Greek Wedding, where if there was any weird stigma attached to that movie, it was whether or not it would translate outside of Asian audiences. And the answer was, yeah, it played really well. It made, $174 million domestically. That's as great a hit as you're going to have, especially from a rom-com in 2018.
Yeah. Definitely one of, I would say, probably the biggest hits of this new era. But before we talk even more about the new era, I did want to go back to some of the oldies. Pretty Woman in particular. I also had no idea just how much of a pain that movie probably was, or definitely was, to make. I would love to hear you talk more about it, but I mean, what surprised? Also, did you have any idea what kind of story you were going to get when you were looking into Pretty Woman?
I kind of knew the very broad strokes of what had happened there. It's been Hollywood lore a little bit that, like, oh, here's this movie that started as this really dark drama and then it got turned into this rom-com. But what I kind of assumed, J.F. Lawton, the screenwriter on that, I talked to for a long time for the book. And I kind of assumed he would be kind of like, I was an artist and they like changed my script, because he really did. I mean, I've read that original script and it's really dark. Like, she is a sex worker who is very much abused by this kind of cruel, hostile billionaire who sort of plays with her emotions and then literally dumps her on the street and throws the money at her. And she takes Kit to Disneyland, and but she's like a broken person is the final shot in the movie. Like, it's really grim. But what I was surprised by was JF was very on board by what they did with the script when, it was, and Julia Roberts has since said she was going to star in that original version. And she has since said, like, she couldn't have played that. And I don't know if that's true or not, but it's certainly true that Pretty Woman, as it came out, could hardly have been a better showcase of her talents. I mean, that was just an instant rocket to A-list fame, and she's great in it. But it's just, it was so interesting to me that when it was Touchstone, it was a Disney imprint, got their hands on it and gave it to Gary Marshall, a guy not necessarily known for his dark dramas. And it's such a strange development process, because you can still see some of the darkness in that movie. I mean, it is still a romantic comedy where there's oral sex before the protagonist kisses the guy. It's still a romantic comedy with an assault scene by Jason Alexander. Like it's some of the stuff that JF wrote is still in there. But at the same time, they really found a way to make it kind of light and breezy. And it's the kind of movie that, if it didn't go through that development process, it could not exist at all. You would never write that script the way it came out. But again, you can't argue with a hit. It is one of the biggest rom-coms of all time. People still adore it. So whatever alchemy came out of what happened there, it worked.
It's like the most successful Frankenstein's monster.
Yeah.
Suppose.
Absolutely.
Just storming through the box office. In terms of other surprises that you found while writing this book, there are a lot of really crazy coincidences that you unearthed in there, but like what's one thing that you were like, that you found out in your reporting that you were like, I cannot believe this is true?
Yeah, God, that's a good question. Let's see. I was really fascinated to talk to all of the people who worked on the Something About Mary hair gel scene, because it's such an iconic scene that, like, it hadn't occurred to me that Cameron Diaz had a lot of reasons to be like, I'm not doing that. And as it turned out, I found out in the reporting, that's exactly what she said, where it was in the script. She never really liked it. She and Peter Farrelly was very, very upfront about, like, she had good reasons to be worried about it. Like, if that scene didn't work, it could have completely ruined her career. And she was, she'd been a model turned actor. She's very like a rising star at that point. That was a year after Best Friend's Wedding. And so to talk to Ann Morgan, the hairdresser on that, who was in the trailer with her the day they were shooting it on location, and came out and said, Cameron's not doing it. Let's try to find a compromise. And what they did is agreed to shoot it both ways. One way where it was like a little bump and you'd barely even notice it, and one where, of course, it's the giant wave. And so that was the deal they struck. And the second Cameron Diaz came out with the wave hairdo, the whole crew busted up and everyone just went, well, that's the version in the movie. But that movie is so interesting because thank you. But that's one of those things that, like, that scene, basically everything that was iconic in that movie I learned in the reporting came with a huge fight with 20th Century Fox, who bought this movie and then instantly seemed to hate everything about it and didn't want to let them do I mean, the Franks and Beans scene with the zipper, the dog licking the face and then getting thrown at, like the dog almost dying in a bunch of different ways. Like there was a lot of stuff in this movie that the studio just had very little faith in. And the Farrellys just fought a constant battle over everything. And so I was kind of amazed. I mean, that was a movie that they hated until the first test screenings. And then suddenly they were like, oh, it turns out people actually want all this stuff. like the Farrellys have been telling them for months. And so reporting that out was really interesting because it's just making a movie. Obviously, making any movie to me seems impossible even now. Even as I've reported all these stories out, it's just like so many things have to go right. And the idea of making any movie, let alone a good movie, it just seems like it shouldn't even be able to happen. But that movie was so much more of a fight than I'd realized.
Yeah, especially because you think about, obviously we laugh at all this like kind of raunchy and gross out comedy, but there were so many more movies that did that probably afterwards that like There's Something About Mary was probably partially responsible for sort of like opening the floodgates to gross out comedy, romantic and otherwise.
Yep. Had to be first.
Yeah, exactly. But another thing that I really loved was I feel like we don't talk about Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore enough.
Yep.
And there was something that she said about, I guess I wrote it down, but just about the universal chord of goofiness in Never Been Kissed, and between the two of them. And I just adore that pairing. Are there any actor pairings that you absolutely adore that you wish would make another movie like right now?
Yeah, I mean, you brought up a good one there in that, like, one of the things I loved reporting about this book is like, especially the people who starred together in multiple movies, like Drew Barrymore and Adam Sandler, like their stories are kind of like rom-coms. Like she saw him and just like liked his energy and asked him out to coffee, but like it wasn't romantic. It was always just like, she just thought they would make a good rom-com couple, and now they've made a bunch of rom-coms. And there's like something about their energy that's very sweet. So like she was totally right. Those are actors that just work together. I think I've thought a lot about the modern day equivalent because there's these pairings that are so iconic of like Julia Roberts and Richard Gere, or Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks, that like clearly, and I think that alchemy is harder to find now, but it makes me wish that Emma Stone and Ryan Gosling would do another rom-com, because I think they are really delightful together, and I think they're really fun in Crazy Stupid Love. But then they've also done Gangster Squad and La La Land, and I like La La Land a lot. I do not so much care for Gangster Squad, which I don't think is a controversial opinion. But there's something about like Ryan Gosling being light is not always something he seems to want to do. And I think he's really charming in stuff like that. And I think they have that kind of ineffable, they spark together. And I would love to see more in that vein. So maybe they'll do one more. I don't know. They seem to like working together.
Yeah, that's a good one. And also, who is an actor, actress that you would just like love to see in a rom-com who's like maybe not really done it or done it enough? Could play this game all day.
I know. It's so what I think about is who would be bringing different energy to the table. Something that I haven't seen them do. I was just thinking about this actually with Tom Holland and Zendaya, how they're like, obviously their big thing now is Spider-Man, but also they're just kind of the hot actors of the moment. And I just thought like they're playing characters in these Spider-Man movies who have a romance that Marvel kind of does its version of. Exactly. Like there's all of that. But I think to see them just play like normal human beings in a relationship, I think that'd be cool. Especially like Euphoria is so intense, and Tom Holland's non-actiony stuff is like very serious stuff like Cherry. But there's such kind of a lightness with, he's got the kind of that life dancer thing, and she can be so like witty and cutting. I think there's some rom-com energy there. I'd like to see them just embrace it.
That's very true. I would love to see them both wear like normal people clothes and have like normal jobs, and like no one is like
they can be architects,
an addict or secretly Spider-Man. Yeah, we gotta. If anyone who can pull some strings is listening, I think that would be a great one.
Something like that. Do it for us, please.
Yeah. We got to talk a little bit about the fall of rom-coms. Obviously, the why is there. I would like to think it's because of Dane Cook, but what you outlined so many different reasons for the fall of the rom-com, but what, for everybody listening, would you say is the sort of shorter version of that?
Yeah, it was a really interesting thing that was happening, because I think rom-coms historically have always gotten unfairly dinged for stuff that wasn't really rom-com's fault. And I think this is another good example of that, where like there were all these death of the rom-com headlines about 10 years ago. And I think the real answer was it was the death of the mid-budget movie. I mean, this was an era in Hollywood when everything was trending towards a $300 million superhero blockbuster or a $10 million drama that might have a shot at Best Picture. And rom-coms really found themselves in the middle of a trend without the ability to go either way, because rom-coms have historically been snubbed by Academy voters and other award shows, unless of course they're about a sad white dude, at which point then like Four Weddings and a Funeral or Silver Linings Playbook or whatever is suddenly a Best Picture contender. Movies I like, but there is a pattern of that happening in a way that doesn't happen with rom-coms centered on women. But at the same time, so I think there was the sense that they couldn't really get the award stuff that the studios continue to hunger for, and they were at a time when studios only wanted home runs. Rom-coms were base hits. They were always profitable. There was never really a moment when, other than obviously bad, there are bad movies that don't make money all the time, but as a genre, it wasn't like audiences just stopped going to rom-coms. There were, the year that The Atlantic ran their big death of the rom-com piece was the same year that About Time came out, a new Richard Curtis rom-com that was very acclaimed and was a fine hit. And like there were always these movies. But I think the sense that studios wanted to throw their weight behind them, that was waning. And I think there weren't necessarily the stars who were all the way in line. I think the material wasn't quite good enough to attract the people who might have been like marquee names. And there was a sense, I think incorrectly, that rom-coms might not translate as well internationally at a time when the international box office was becoming more important. I think a good rom-com can and does, but I think all of those things were sort of factors in what was happening.
Yeah. It's interesting because, of course, we have to bring up the rise of streaming. And I think Netflix, a company that also basically is now known for doing middle brow, mid-budget. Not that every rom-com has to be middle brow for sure. The existence of something like Netflix means that we're getting a ton of these. We're getting also the sort of competitive Christmas movie universe to compete with Hallmark and Lifetime that are like romantic comedies. And then we're also getting, as you mentioned, The Kissing Booth and To All the Boys.
Yep.
To All the Boys. And I never really thought about, you're totally right that they are franchises. And I never put two and two together that this is becoming the like extended universe of rom-coms. Yeah. Which is sort of terrifying to me. Mm-hmm. Do you think that this is a sustainable trend of the sort of like franchisization of rom-coms, especially when so much hinges on there being sort of like a happy ending that it's like, how can you keep making these movies?
I mean, it's interesting to watch them do it. I think it's actually been pretty good creatively. Like one rom-com that I think is undersung that has never quite gotten us to, even though it was a reasonable box office hit, is Bridget Jones's Baby. Because I am very much not a fan of the second Bridget Jones movie, The Edge of Reason, nor incidentally are most of the people who made Bridget Jones. But I think Bridget Jones's Baby is just like, because you have a successful character that people know, that people want to see more of, for a long time, it was just kind of treated, there was this cliche of like what happens after Happily Ever After, and that was like not a story that people really wanted to tell. But I actually think that is a pretty interesting story. And because of the demands of just like the natural Hollywood cycle now of anything successful needs to be franchised out, I think that actually forces you to make the relationships a little more complicated, the characters a little deeper. And so I think a talented filmmaker can sort of make hay with that and go, to All the Boys is a little trickier because it's based on books, even though the movies kind of took it their own way, which is the other thing I think we're seeing more of, just as they want proof that anything is going to be a hit. It helps if there's some sort of track record there. But I do think there is something richer about approaching these things as franchises if you do it with the proper care, and say, we're going to do the whole story of Laura Jean and these To All the Boys movies, and it's not just going to be about her being the shy girl who has this sort of this classic rom-com arrangement with this guy, but then they really fall for each other. But then like the second movie is about them kind of like dealing with the weirdness of being a real couple, and then the third movie is what they're going to do when they go to college, and like that's a very complete young romance in a way that the first movie could not have possibly sustained. So I kind of like it. At least, I mean, there are also certainly plenty of examples of bad versions of that, but I'm optimistic. I'd like to think we can keep seeing good ones.
Yeah, that's actually, I think maybe I disliked it more in in name than actually in function. You're right. It brings almost not a full, I'm not going to say all levels of realism to it, but it forces development beyond just like an ending that someone might slap on and hope that it does well with viewers.
Right.
I also think that, as I mentioned with TV before, like starting to see a lot of episodic rom-coms, Mindy Kaling's For Weddings adaptation, which was obviously very different, but also things like Starstruck and even like, I mean, Modern Love is sort of different because it's an adaptation of stories from a podcast, but all these different ways of making like episodic romances are just like interesting as far as storytelling goes. We will take some questions in a minute, but I already asked you about your favorite all-time rom-com. I have two more questions. Was there a question or a topic or something that just like haunted you the entire time you were writing this book?
Wow.
Save it for the end.
I couldn't get the answer to?
No, maybe you did. Either way, just something that like, yeah.
I think the thing that drove me craziest, and I could feel it coming as I was writing the closing chapters, because I more or less wrote this in chronological order, is there is cool stuff happening in rom-coms right now, and I knew I would have to turn in the draft before I got to cover. I was at least able to allude to the rom-coms coming out this year, but by the time I was done with the book, I couldn't really get into the stuff that I would have really liked to, which is, we've got the two J-Lo rom-coms this year. We've got Bros from Billy Eichner and Fire Island. Like there's a lot of, even The Lost City, this new Sandra Bullock, Channing Tatum, like quasi-romancing the stone action, like the studios are getting back into rom-coms. They're kind of doing it in a weird hybrid blockbuster way, which even Marry Me, like every trailer has that, big, she's the biggest pop star in the world at the biggest concert, and they're really pushing that set piece. So I'm really curious about how studios are hybridizing and like trying to sell rom-coms as they get back in, because clearly they've realized, partially from looking at streamers, that money is on the table. And that leads me to the other detour that drove me insane, because I literally started writing this and then I realized I would add 1,000 pages to the book, is the Netflix Christmas rom-com cinematic universe that you briefly alluded to, where the fact that like the Princess Switch movies cross over with the Christmas Prince movies, and now they're crossing over with The Castle for Christmas, which means Scotland exists. Like, if you haven't seen these movies, it's so crazy. They just slip in cameos, and they're all in these fake countries that are like vaguely Western European and celebrating Christmas all the time, called like Aldovia and Karemia and all this stuff. And like, I tried to start kind of writing about what Netflix was doing there, and I just realized I would go mad. Like, there was no way to capture it in real time. But it's super weird. People always talk about the Marvel connected stuff and sometimes the Conjuring stuff, but like Netflix is secretly doing a third one, and very few people have noticed it yet. So if you haven't watched those movies, it's crazy. Check it out.
Yeah, that is, that could be a whole separate book.
Mm-hmm.
And are there any other rom-com or romantic adjacent movies that you personally love that you just really don't get to talk about enough? Yes,
absolutely. God, there's so many, and most of them I try to get into the book one way or another, because of course that was the fun. But I think there are more recent movies that I didn't really get into in the way that I would have liked to. Partially because part of when I was writing this book, I had an eye on. It was easier to pick some of the older movies because you kind of tell what it had the cultural impact, and to predict that is a little harder. But there's stuff I really liked, like. I really love Sleeping with Other People, Leslie Headland movie with Alison Brie and Jason Sudeikis. I think that's great. If you haven't seen that, check that out. I really love Man Up with Simon Pegg and Lake Bell. That's a really terrific kind of classic rom-com, but sort of clever, and has the craziest third act structural choice that I can't even. It's a reference to another movie, and I cannot spoil it if you haven't seen it, because it's so fun and good. And then there were just tunnels that I would have liked to go a little deeper into. There's an anime rom-com I love called The Night is Short, Walk On Girl. It's on HBO Max. If you're watching, haven't seen that, it's great. And I loved seeing an animated rom-com. I think more should exist. That's a movie about a girl who can drink more than anyone else. It's really impressive. And a guy who's been crushing on her and just sort of follows her as she sort of does a bar crawl and like is working up the ability to like confess his feelings. And I just found it like weird and stylish and delightful in a way that I was like, there's still so much life in this genre for people to like do stuff that hasn't been done before. So yeah, check that out if you haven't. The Night is Short, Walk On Girl. It's great.
That's great. Okay, we're gonna take some questions. I see that there are some in the chat right now. Paul says, I'm halfway through the book and love it. If you were making a movie with a decent sized budget, what kind of rom-com would you make?
Wow. Oh, this is my dream. I get to play like fantasy rom-com. And thank you. I'd go with a modern, like I try to do a modern love thing because I've seen so many versions of it that don't totally work, where what they're doing is stuff like Friends with Benefits or No Strings Attached, where they're trying to do like what modern dating is really like, but they don't really, in the end, it's ultimately about like a monogamous couple. Like I'd like to see a non-traditional relationship where they really embrace what that is. I'd take my shot at that.
Yeah, I was thinking, I'm like, we haven't seen hasn't been a rom-com about like an open relationship.
Yeah, do a poly rom-com and then don't make that like, and take that serious. Do that as like a real relationship people can have. I think that's interesting. I think someone should do it. Maybe me, if someone gives me that budget.
If anybody's got some money lying around. Paul also has a second question. Were there non-rom-com movies you've seen where you thought they should have made this a rom-com?
Oh my God, I love that question. I mean, I kind of think everything.
Which is basically, we can call that the Pretty Woman treatment right now.
Right, exactly. How can we convert this? I don't know if I'd go full on rom-com, but especially because superhero movies are such a monoculture right now, I find like the sexlessness of Marvel really frustrating. And I think a lot of people have sort of gotten frustrated with that. That's come up a little more recently. They sort of tried. Eternals had the first sex scene in a Marvel movie.
I did not know that.
But I just, if this is the genre that we're going to be, that Hollywood's all in on right now, like, can we at least do a little more cross-pollinating with other genres? And I think to do like a superhero rom-com that is not My Super Ex-Girlfriend, which is terrible. If you haven't seen that, don't watch it. A very hateful, misogynistic take on a superhero romantic comedy. But I'd like to see someone do a good version of that.
And Thomas says, what were your favorite old classic semantic comedies?
Semantic? I'm gonna guess that's romantic.
Yeah, I don't know if it was corrected, but semantic, like semantic.
Yeah.
Maybe it means romantic.
Yeah, either it's something I need to unpack more. Well, it's an interesting idea, semantic comedy.
I know, it was like a lot of talking.
Yeah, I mean, this was part of what was painful about writing the book, is that like there were so many movies I wanted to get into, but by picking this period of time, that was partially deliberately done just because I knew the people who I want to talk to were still around. And even then, with When Harry Met Sally, I obviously couldn't talk to Nora Ephron. For Pretty Woman, I obviously couldn't talk to Gary Marshall. But I would have loved to get into the older movies. For me, I love His Girl Friday. I love The Philadelphia Story. I love Bring Up Baby. I barely get into it in the intro, which was sort of crushing. But there are so many classic rom-coms, and I think so many rom-coms that modern filmmakers did take inspiration from and continue to. I mean, you can't really talk about screwball comedies without it's stuff like How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days is so clearly influenced by kind of the workplace comedies and the Battle of the Sexes stuff. So that's the stuff I really like. And I could watch any of those movies anytime, and probably will.
Yeah, I'm ready to watch more now. If there are any other questions for the Zoom people, please drop them in the Q&A. Otherwise, Michael, do you have any questions from the YouTube to carry over?
I do not right now. So if you want to wrap it up, feel free to.
Absolutely.
Great. All right. Well, you got 1 second to add some more questions in the Q&A, but otherwise, this has been a great conversation, great for early Valentine's Day time. And Scott, thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for having us at Chaucer's. And go buy From Hollywood with Love, The Rise and Fall and Rise Again of romantic comedy. Yeah, we'll all be watching our movies.
All right. My pleasure. Thanks to everyone, and happy early Valentine's Day.
All right.
Thank you both, Samantha and Scott. It was a wonderful talk, and I wish you both the best in the coming months. And I look forward to meeting you both in person.
Yes.
And thank you everyone for joining us, and have a nice evening. Good night.
Good night.